The decision was final. The Galactic Council had spoken. From their shining towers on the core worlds, the leaders of the greatest civilizations in the galaxy announced their ruling. The outer colonies, a vast stretch of planets on the edge of known space, were to be abandoned. The Kryn, a monstrous hive mind species, had invaded the sector. They moved like a swarm, devouring everything in their path. The Council had sent fleets to fight them before, but the Kryn were endless. Every battle cost too much, and the Council decided the price was too high. So they sealed the gates. All jump lanes to the outer colonies were shut down. No more ships would be sent. No more aid would come. The message was clear: you are on your own. Across the Forsaken Worlds, panic spread like wildfire. Entire planets, once thriving with trade and industry, fell into chaos. Cities burned, leaders fled, and the Kryn advanced without resistance. Billions of innocent beings screamed for help, and no one answered. No one, except humanity. On Terra Prime, the heart of human space, the news spread fast. The Galactic Council had turned its back on the outer colonies, leaving millions of helpless beings to die. But humans were not like the other species of the galaxy. They had seen hardship before. They had fought against impossible odds. And more than anything, they had never abandoned their own. And so, they refused to abandon others. The Terran Accord, the ruling body of humanity, called an emergency meeting. The Council had given them no orders, no permission to act, but humanity did not need permission to do the right thing. Fleet Admiral Elias Carter stood before the leaders of the Accord. His voice was firm, his face hard as stone. The Galactic Council has chosen to abandon those who trusted them. We will not make the same mistake. A murmur spread through the chamber. Many leaders were uncertain. The Kryn were a nightmare, a force that even the strongest fleets struggled to fight. Humanity was small compared to the mighty empires of the core worlds. But then, a voice rose from the crowd. A scientist from Mars, an old woman with bright eyes and a fire in her soul. If we don't stand for them now, who will stand for us when our time comes? Silence. Then, one by one, the leaders of the Terran Accord stood up. They voted. The answer was unanimous. Humanity would not stand by. They would fight. Across human space, the call to arms echoed. Old warships were pulled from storage. Freighters were converted into rescue ships. Factories worked day and night to build weapons, shields, and defenses. Scientists, engineers, and soldiers, all of them volunteered. The First Fleet, called the Lantern Armada, set out within days. Its mission was simple: find survivors, protect them, bring them home. Their first destination, Valkar 7, a small but heavily populated planet that had sent out distress signals for weeks. As the fleet arrived, the horror of the situation became clear. Cities lay in ruins. Smoke rose into the sky. The Kryn were everywhere, crawling through the streets like a black tide. Their chittering voices echoed in the air. But in the center of the devastation, a final group of survivors held strong. They had no weapons, no army, only a few security officers and whatever scrap they could turn into barricades. They were tired, hungry, losing hope. Then, from the skies, humanity arrived. The first blasts came from orbit. Railgun fire rained down from the human warships, breaking apart Kryn swarms like glass shattering. Dropships screamed down through the atmosphere, landing with powerful shockwaves. The survivors watched in disbelief as human soldiers poured out. Not just warriors, but medics, engineers, and rescue teams. They did not come to conquer. They came to save. For the first time in weeks, the people of Valkar 7 dared to hope. And for the first time in history, the Kryn faced an enemy who did not fear them. From the safety of the core worlds, the Galactic Council watched in silence. They had abandoned the outer colonies. They had left those worlds to die. And yet, humanity refused to let them fall. The survivors of Valkar 7 could hardly believe it. For weeks, they had lived in terror, hiding from the Kryn, waiting for the end. The Galactic Council had abandoned them, leaving them to die. But now ships filled the sky, human ships. Soldiers fought in the streets, pushing back the alien swarm. Medics and engineers moved swiftly, treating the wounded, repairing what little was left. For the first time in a long time, they were not alone. Admiral Elias Carter stood on the bridge of the TA's Resolute, watching the battle unfold below. The Kryn were vicious, their insect-like forms swarming the ruined city, but humanity fought differently. They didn't rely on brute force. They used strategy, precision, and relentless teamwork. "Target the bridges," Carter ordered. "Cut off their reinforcements." From orbit, human warships unleashed hell. Railguns fired, plasma cannons roared, and in mere minutes, the Kryn's advance was shattered. On the ground, Captain Mira Solis led her unit through the ruined streets. They weren't just here to fight. They were here to save people. "Clear a path to the shelters," she called. "Get those civilians out." A young alien girl, her small hands clutching a tattered blanket, peeked out from a crumbling building. Her parents had told her to hide, to stay quiet. But then she saw something she never expected. A human soldier reaching out to her, offering his hand. "You're safe now," the soldier said with a smile. The girl hesitated for only a second before running into his arms. She believed him. The galaxy watches. News of the battle spread fast. Holostreams carried the footage across the galaxy. People watched in stunned silence as humanity did what the Council refused to do. On the core worlds, citizens murmured in shock. Some cheered for humanity, inspired by their courage. Others were ashamed that their own leaders had abandoned billions. On the Senate floor of the Galactic Council, an emergency meeting was called. A holographic screen played live footage from Valkyr 7. Humans shielding civilians, escorting families to safety, fighting and dying for a world that wasn't their own. "They defy our orders," one senator growled. "This is reckless." "This is heroism," another whispered. The council was divided. Some wanted to punish humanity for their disobedience. Others knew that punishing them would mean admitting their own failure. For now, the council did nothing. They simply watched. Hope rises. With the Kryn pushed back, the rescue ships descended. Thousands of survivors, weak but grateful, were guided onto transport vessels. Many had lost everything: their homes, their families, their entire way of life. As they boarded the ships, an alien elder approached Admiral Carter. He was frail, his scaled skin marked with age and sorrow. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk your lives for us?" Carter looked at the old man, then at the thousands of people his fleet had saved. "Because we could," Carter said simply. "Because someone had to." Tears welled in the elder's eyes. The Galactic Council had turned its back on them. The Kryn had tried to erase them, but humanity had chosen to stand with them. They were no longer alone. A new alliance. The Lantern Armada did not stop with Valkyr 7. One by one, they reached out to the abandoned worlds. They sent rescue ships to dying planets, offered shelter to refugees, and armed those willing to fight. Soon, entire fleets of survivors followed in humanity's wake, aliens from different worlds, different species, all united by a single truth: humanity had not abandoned them. On the bridge of the Resolute, Carter watched the growing fleet. Some were human ships, others were alien craft, barely holding together, but ready to stand and fight. He turned to Captain Mira Solis. "We can't do this alone," he admitted, "but we don't have to." She smiled. "No, Admiral, we don't." For the first time in history, the abandoned had found a home. And together, they would stand against the darkness. The Kryn did not forget. They had suffered a defeat on Valkyr 7, a world they thought was already theirs. But instead of easy prey, they had found humanity. For the first time, their endless swarm had been stopped. The Kryn hated obstacles. They hated resistance, and they never allowed their enemies to survive. So they gathered their forces, built up their strength, and chose their next target, a planet called Relosphore. The invasion begins. Relosphore was a small rocky world with vast underground cities. Once a mining colony, it had become a refuge for thousands of survivors from the abandoned worlds. The people of Relosphore had few weapons, fewer ships, and no hope. But they had one thing the Kryn didn't expect. They had humanity. A small fleet of Terran warships had arrived days before, bringing supplies and engineers. Captain Mira Solis and her team worked day and night to turn Relosphore into a fortress. They reinforced defenses. They set traps. They prepared for war. And just in time, because the Kryn were coming. The warning came in the form of a dark shadow moving across the stars. Kryn warships, dozens of them, descended like a storm, their organic hulls shifting like living creatures. Then the sky turned red. The first blasts rained down from orbit, striking the surface like fire from the heavens. Buildings shattered. The ground shook. Screams echoed through the tunnels as the Kryn drop pods smashed into the cities below. The invasion had begun. The battle for Relosphore. Mira stood on the front lines, her soldiers positioned behind makeshift barricades. The air trembled with the distant roars of Kryn warriors. She gripped her communicator. "Status," she demanded. A voice crackled through. "Admiral Elias Carter from the orbiting flagship. The TA is resolute." "Shields are holding," he replied. "But we're outnumbered 10-1. Mira took a deep breath. Outnumbered wasn't new. Outnumbered was what humans did best. "We hold the line," she said, "no matter what." The Kryn charged. They swarmed the tunnels, screeching and clawing, their twisted forms moving faster than any living thing should. They thought the refugees would scatter, that the humans would retreat. They were wrong. The moment the Kryn entered the tunnels, the traps were triggered. Explosives detonated, collapsing pathways, and sealing the Kryn in tight corridors. Automated turrets activated, cutting through the swarm with precise bursts of energy. And then, the soldiers opened fire. Humans and refugees fought side by side. Some held rifles, others used scavenged weapons, but no one ran. Because this was their home now, and they were not giving it up. The sky burns. In orbit, the battle was just as fierce. The TA is resolute, and its fleet faced wave after wave of Kryn warships. Human pilots weaved through the chaos, using speed and tactics to outmaneuver the massive enemy vessels. Admiral Carter barked orders as his crew scrambled to hold the line. "Target their command ships. We break them from the top." The human fleet was smaller, but they were smarter. They used asteroid fields for cover, set traps with mines and decoys, and hit the Kryn where they were weakest. And slowly, the tide began to turn. The unbreakable spirit. Back on the ground, the battle raged on. Mira's unit was pushed back to the last defensive line. They were out of ammo, out of options, and almost out of time. But then, a sound echoed through the tunnels. Engines. The survivors looked up just in time to see dropships descending from the sky. Human reinforcements. The doors slammed open, and fresh troops poured out, weapons blazing. The Kryn, for the first time, hesitated. Humanity never stopped fighting. They fought with everything they had, not for conquest, not for power, but for each other. And in that moment, the Kryn realized something terrifying. They were not facing just another enemy. They were facing a force that refused to fall. Victory, but at a cost. Hours later, the battle was over. The Kryn, broken and beaten, retreated. Their warships flowed into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of their failed invasion. The refugees of Relosphore cheered, but the victory had come at a cost. Many had fallen. Soldiers, civilians, even entire families. Their names would never be forgotten. As the survivors gathered in the ruins of their city, Admiral Carter stood beside Mira, watching the sunset. "They'll be back. Mira said. Carter nodded. Let them come. Because now, the abandoned worlds had hope, and with humanity at their side, they would never fall again. The battle for Relosfor was over. The Kryn had been defeated, their forces scattered, their ships retreating into the darkness of space. The refugees and human soldiers stood victorious. But victory came at a price. The city was in ruins. Smoke still rose from the battlefield. Thousands had died, and the survivors, though grateful, were weary, wounded, and uncertain of the future. Captain Mira Solis walked through the makeshift field hospital, where medics worked tirelessly to treat the injured. Among the patients were humans and aliens alike, all bearing the scars of war. She stopped beside a young soldier, a human barely in his 20s, his arm bandaged and his face pale. He gave her a weak smile. "Did we win?" he asked. Mira knelt beside him and nodded. "Yeah, we won. But for how long?" A message from the Council. High above the planet, aboard the TS Resolute, Admiral Elias Carter stood before a massive holographic screen. The image of Senator Drail Voles, a high-ranking member of the Galactic Council, flickered into view. The old alien's expression was grim. "Admiral Carter," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval. "The Council has been monitoring your actions." Carter crossed his arms. "I'm sure you have." Voss sighed. "You disobeyed direct orders. You intervened in a conflict that was not yours. Do you understand what this means?" Carter's jaw tightened. "It means we did what you wouldn't." A tense silence filled the air. Then Voss leaned forward. "You've made humanity a target." Carter frowned. "What do you mean?" Voss's voice dropped. "The Kryn do not forget, Admiral. You embarrassed them. You stopped their advance. And now, they will come for you." Carter's expression hardened. "Let them come." Voss shook his head. "You don't understand. The Kryn aren't just sending raiding parties anymore." The hologram shifted, showing a massive fleet gathering in deep space. Hundreds of Kryn warships, larger and more powerful than anything seen before. "They are preparing for war, Carter, and they are coming straight for Terra. A choice to make." Back on Relosfor, Mira gathered with her officers in the command center. The news had spread quickly. The Kryn were not just seeking revenge. They were planning an all-out assault on humanity itself. One of the alien leaders, a reptilian warrior named Tessikvar, stepped forward. "This is not just your fight, Captain. The Kryn want to wipe out all who oppose them." Another, a bird-like scientist named Dr. Vera, nodded. "If Terra falls, the rest of us won't be far behind." Mira looked at the gathered refugees, the soldiers, the civilians who had just fought to survive. And she made her decision. "Then we take the fight to them." The Rising Alliance. Across the abandoned worlds, a call to arms was sent. Every planet that humanity had saved, every species that had been left behind by the Council, now had a choice. Would they run, or would they stand and fight? The response was overwhelming. Ships that had once been used for trade were now converted for war. Fighters were built, weapons were forged, and an alliance was born. Not just humans, not just soldiers, but refugees, exiles, and those who had once been considered weak. Together, they would prove the galaxy wrong. The last stand begins. Admiral Carter stood on the bridge of the Resolute, watching as the fleet gathered. Hundreds of ships, some old, some barely holding together, but all ready for battle. Mira joined him, arms crossed. "They won't expect this." Carter smirked. "That's the plan." For the first time in history, the abandoned, the forgotten, and the Forsaken had an army. And when the Kryn came for Terra, humanity would not stand alone. The galaxy held its breath. The Kryn were coming. The invasion force was the largest ever seen. Hundreds of warships, swarms of fighters, and unstoppable numbers. Their target was Terra, the home of humanity. But humanity was not alone. Across the abandoned worlds, refugees, Exiles and forgotten species had joined them. The rising alliance was no longer just a dream. It was real, and they would not go down without a fight. A desperate plan. Aboard the TS Resolute, Admiral Elias Carter studied the battle maps. The Kryn fleet was massive, too massive. If they reached Terra, the planet wouldn't stand a chance. They needed a way to stop them. Captain Mira Solis stood beside him. "We can't win in a direct fight," she said. "We have to hit them before they reach the Sol system." Carter nodded. "We lure them into a trap." Tessikvar, the reptilian war leader of the refugee forces, let out a deep growl. "A trap? Against the Kryn?" "Yes." Carter pointed at a system on the map. Vega 9, an asteroid field between the abandoned worlds and Sol. "We make our stand here." Mira frowned. "That system is a graveyard. No one fights there and survives." Carter gave a grim smile. "Then we make sure the Kryn don't survive either." The trap is set. The rising alliance moved quickly. They scattered thousands of mines in the asteroid field, set up hidden turrets on drifting rocks, and prepared a surprise attack. Their ships hid within the dense asteroid belt, waiting, watching. And then, the Kryn arrived. Their fleet moved like a dark storm, spreading through space with terrifying speed. They were eager for battle, eager to crush the defiant humans and their weak allies. But as soon as the first wave entered the asteroid field, the trap sprang shut. The ambush. Explosions ripped through space as the mines detonated, tearing through Kryn warships. Turrets hidden among the asteroids opened fire, cutting into the enemy ranks. Then, from the shadows, the rising alliance struck. Fighters swarmed out like a tidal wave, moving faster and sharper than the Kryn had ever seen. They weren't fighting for territory. They weren't fighting for conquest. They were fighting to survive. And they fought like demons. Mira's ship, the TAS Valiant, weaved through the chaos, dodging enemy fire as she led her squadron straight into the heart of the Kryn fleet. "Break their lines," she ordered. Her pilots responded instantly, diving into the swarm and targeting the command ships. One by one, the massive Kryn warships began to fall. The turning point. For the first time in history, the Kryn were afraid. They had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated the abandoned. But the battle wasn't over. The Kryn flagship, a monstrous warship twice the size of the Resolute, pushed forward. Its cannons fired, shattering asteroids, tearing through ships, and forcing the rising alliance to fall back. If it reached the other side of the asteroid field, the path to Terra would be open. Carter saw it. "We have to stop that ship." Mira's voice came over the comms. "I have an idea." Her ship, the Valiant, broke formation and charged straight toward the Kryn flagship. Carter's eyes widened. "Mira, what are you doing?" Her voice was steady. "Buying us a chance." The Kryn flagship locked onto her, weapons charged. And then, she vanished. The Valiant disappeared into the asteroids, using the debris as cover, flying dangerously close to the massive ship. Then, at the last second, she dropped every explosive she had directly onto the enemy's weak point, its engine core. Mira barely had time to escape before. Boom. The Kryn flagship exploded, sending a massive shockwave through space. The enemy fleet, leaderless and broken, began to retreat. The rising alliance had won. The aftermath. As the surviving ships regrouped, cheers rang out across the comms. But Mira wasn't celebrating. She stood in her ship's wrecked command center, looking at the damage, at the names of those who had been lost. They had won, but at a cost. Carter's voice came through the radio. "Mira, you still alive?" She exhaled, then smiled. "Yeah, barely." "Good, because we're not done yet." The Kryn had been stopped, but they would return. And now, humanity and its allies had one final chance to prepare. Because the next battle would be for Terra itself. The galaxy trembled. The battle in the Vega 9 asteroid field had been a victory, but the war was far from over. The Kryn fleet had retreated, but they were not defeated. Their forces were regrouping, gathering strength for the final attack. And this time, their target was Terra, humanity's homeworld, the place where it all began. A race against time. On board the T.S. Resolute, Admiral Elias Carter stood before a massive holographic display. The enemy fleet was moving fast, too fast. They would reach Terra in days. Beside him, Captain Mira Solis studied the data. "We don't have enough ships," she said. Carter exhaled. "We'll never have enough ships." But they had something better. They had the Rising Alliance. Word had spread across the abandoned worlds. The battle at Vega 9 had proven one thing: humanity could fight. And now, the galaxy was ready to fight with them. One by one, ships arrived. Rebel fleets from forgotten colonies. Exiled warriors who had lost their homes. Traders, smugglers, and scavengers who had nothing left to lose. And most importantly, aliens who had once feared the Kryn, now standing beside humanity. For the first time in history, the outcasts of the galaxy had united. Not under a flag, not under a government, but under one purpose: to stop the Kryn, to save Terra. Preparing for war. The human homeworld had been a peaceful place for centuries. Now it had become a fortress. The orbital defenses were reinforced. Ground forces trained night and day. Civilians were evacuated to underground bunkers. Even the moon bases were turned into battle stations. Still, everyone knew the truth. This would be humanity's hardest battle. Mira stood in the hangar of the TAS Valiant, watching as mechanics rushed to repair the damage from the last fight. Tessic Var, the reptilian war leader, approached her. "Your people fight like nothing I've ever seen." Mira smirked. "That's because we don't know how to quit." Tessic let out a deep laugh. "Good, because neither do the Kryn." The Kryn's arrival. The warning came faster than expected. Kryn ships detected on long-range scanners. Thousands of them. The Rising Alliance moved into position. The fleet formed a defensive line in front of Terra, waiting as the Kryn approached. The sky darkened. The enemy arrived in endless waves, their organic warships twisting and shifting, their weapons glowing like fire. The Kryn wanted destruction, but humanity was ready. Admiral Carter's voice echoed across the comms. "All ships, hold the line. The battle for Terra had begun." The sky burns. The first wave hit hard. Kryn ships swarmed, firing plasma bolts that tore through the void. But the Rising Alliance fought back. Human warships, smaller but faster, weaved through the enemy ranks, targeting weak points. Alien allies used their unique tech to disrupt Kryn formations. The battlefield turned into chaos. Mira led her squadron straight into the heart of the enemy. Her fighter twisted, dodging fire, returning shots with deadly precision. "Stay together. Don't let them break our lines," she commanded. One by one, Kryn ships exploded, but more kept coming. Too many. And then, a massive Kryn battleship broke through the defenses. It headed straight for Terra. The ground battle. The Kryn landed. Drop pods crashed into the cities, unleashing horrifying creatures. The streets became a war zone. Soldiers and civilians fought side by side. Every building, every street became a battlefield. Even the old and the wounded picked up weapons, because this was their home, and they would not lose it. Mira's fighter crash-landed near a military outpost. She crawled out, injured but alive. Around her, human soldiers and alien allies held the line against an unstoppable horde. She grabbed a rifle. This fight wasn't over yet. One last hope. Admiral Carter's flagship was heavily damaged. The fleet was breaking. The Kryn were winning. But then, a new fleet arrived. More ships, more reinforcements. They weren't military. They weren't soldiers. They were civilians, traders, miners, refugees. People who had once been abandoned by the galaxy, now returning to fight. A voice echoed across the comms. You saved us. Now it's our turn. The rising alliance had grown bigger than anyone imagined. And for the first time, the Kryn began to fear. Because humanity refused to fall, and neither would the galaxy. The final battle had begun. The battle for Terra had reached its breaking point. The Kryn were everywhere. Above, their warships darkened the sky, raining fire upon the cities below. On the ground, their monstrous warriors pushed forward, overwhelming the defenders. Humanity was outnumbered, outgunned. But they were not broken. Because for the first time in history, they were not fighting alone. The rising alliance, refugees, exiles, and forgotten species, stood together. And together, they would not let Terra fall. The final defense. Captain Mira Solis wiped sweat and dust from her face, gripping her rifle tightly. She and a squad of humans and alien allies held their position at the ruins of an old military outpost. Blaster fire lit up the battlefield as they fought to stop the Kryn advance. A soldier shouted, "They're breaking through." Mira turned. Kryn warriors charged forward, their claws slicing through the defenses. But then, a loud roar shook the ground. From the hills, a group of Tessikvar's reptilian warriors stormed down, massive and armored, tearing into the enemy. Mira smirked. "Took you long enough." Tessik grinned. "Had to make an entrance." The battle raged on. The sky burns. High above, in the darkness of space, the fleet battle had reached chaos. Admiral Elias Carter gripped the edge of his command table as the TA's Resolute shook violently. A Kryn warship was locking weapons on them. "Shields are failing," an officer called out. Carter refused to retreat. Terra was below them. If they left, the planet was lost. But before the Kryn ship could fire, a massive explosion tore through the enemy side. Carter's eyes widened. New ships had arrived. More allies, freighter pilots who had modified their ships for war. Old veterans who had come out of hiding. Entire worlds that had once turned away, now standing with humanity. Carter exhaled. All ships pushed forward. The rising alliance surged into the Kryn fleet. For the first time, the Kryn fell back. A desperate gamble. But on the ground, things were getting worse. The Kryn had unleashed their war beast, a massive, hulking creature, standing twice the size of a tank, its armored hide resistant to weapons. It marched toward the central city, where thousands of civilians were hiding. Mira saw it and cursed. "We need heavy firepower." Carter's voice came through the radio. "There's only one way. A nuclear warhead." The fleet had one last missile, but it had to be delivered manually. A silence fell over the comms. Then Mira spoke. "I'll do it." Carter's voice was quiet. "Mira." She took a breath. "We knew this would be a one-way fight." She climbed into an old attack craft, the warhead locked onto the hull. As she flew toward the Kryn war beast, the entire battlefield seemed to pause. The Kryn fired at her. Her ship took hits, but she kept going. And then, she crashed straight into the beast's core. Boom! A massive explosion lit up the battlefield. When the dust settled, the war beast was gone, and Mira's ship was nowhere to be seen. The Kryn retreat. The enemy forces broke. Their fleet, their warriors, their confidence, all shattered. The Kryn, once unstoppable, were now running. Across the battlefield, cheers erupted. Carter watched as the last Kryn ships flood into the void. The war was over. Terra was safe. But as he looked at the battlefield, at the wreckage, at the people they had lost, he knew that victory had come at a cost. A new dawn. Days passed. The dead were honored. The wounded were treated. The cities were rebuilt. And as the sun rose over Terra, something changed. Humanity had always been seen as the forgotten race, the exiles, the ones left behind. But now, They were the protectors. They had not only saved themselves, they had saved the galaxy. And the galaxy would not forget. At a massive gathering, leaders from every world stood before Carter. One of them, an alien elder, spoke. "Humanity, we once turned our backs on you, but today we stand with you. We owe you our future." Carter nodded, his voice steady. "Then let's build it together." And so, from the ashes of war, a new age began, the age of the Rising Alliance. The age where humanity led the way. Because when the galaxy had abandoned them, humanity refused to let them fall. The end.